You see the light turns on, and then
Yeah, I'm going to. There's only one of them,
good morning, and sorry for the slight delay. Welcome to the press conference of Hail, the Australian film in the Orizzonti competition. I would like to introduce you to our guest today. First of all, we have producer Michael Cody. Then we have lead actors Liam Leitch and Daniel P. Jones, and director, scriptwriter, and producer Amiel Courtin-Wilson. Of course, this meeting is quite informal, quite casual, so if ever you have questions, you are welcome to raise your hand, and you can ask questions in both English and Italian, so there is no problem about that. There will be a simultaneous translation. As a way to start this meeting, I would like to ask Amiel about his collaboration with Daniel and Leanne, because this film is the result of a long process that has been developing throughout the years. And this film, in some ways, is a combination of documentary-inspired fiction and imagination out of the reality, out of the mind of the characters. So I would like you to introduce us to the universe of Hail throughout the process that brought to the film.
I first met the man to my left and the woman to my left about 6 years ago. I met Daniel at a theatre company in Melbourne, Australia called Plan B, which was primarily founded to rehabilitate ex-prison inmates. And I met Daniel, I think it was about 18 hours after he was released from prison. My first impressions turning up to film the rehearsals of this theatre company, I didn't know that Danny would be arriving, and I saw a man on the outer edges of the periphery of the group, a little bit on edge, and I went up to introduce myself with a camera in my hand, and when he turned to greet me, I was met with these eyes and this intensity, this physicality that had such a coiled, kind of dense violence and to it, or potential violence, because he was, literally 12 hours out of jail. But what I was also struck by was there was something else in those eyes that was at once compassionate and intelligent and had an amazing acerbic humor. And as I began to witness his skills as a performer, he'd never acted before. This was literally a part of the conditions of his parole to be released from prison, to be released into this theatre company. And so as I saw his skills as a performer, which were so absolutely mercurial, and it was so obvious that he was so profoundly gifted, to be able to harness this energy and harness what was obviously a lifetime of both adversity and some kind of he is like an autodidact. Danny is like a jail cell philosopher who's equally comfortable quoting Latin and Oscar Wilde as he is talking about violent street brawls growing up in his teens. So we became friends, and as with most of my films, the friendship and the relationship, I've previously made documentaries, that is first and foremost, and the film sort of comes second. So we became very close. I lived with Danny at times. Danny lived with me. I met his partner Leanne, who is an absolutely phenomenally generous, kind-hearted, and amazing woman. And I was struck by their relationship. I basically gathered stories from Danny and Leanne, primarily Danny, for about 4 years. Most of which were based around Danny's various exploits as a criminal in Australia, and his time in jail, and his time growing up on the streets as a homeless adolescent. And for a long time, the film was going to actually be a documentary, and it wasn't until 4 or 5 years into this relationship, into this very deep friendship, that I realized that the film was not primarily a film about crime, but it was a love story. And the thing that was most touching and most, I suppose, had the emotional critical mass that enabled the feature film to take shape was Danny and Leanne's love for one another, and their love for one another in the face of such adversity and such, I suppose, volatile living environment. So that was really, I suppose, the the genesis of Hale.
Well, then I would like to obviously ask Daniel and Leanne about this process from their point of view. I mean, getting acquainted with Amiel and accepting to expose yourself and give yourself with generosity throughout your stories and throughout your performances in the film.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to say that when I first saw Amiel, I was struck by this man that had come to do a documentary on a theatre company of released prisoners, and there was about 15 people at any one stage. That some of the guys had been in prison for 25 years for multiple murder. There was a number of those. There was a few that had been in for 2 or 3 years for doing robberies and things like that. And my first introduction to the system was when I was a child for the crime of being born, because my mother and father were separated, and my mother was seriously ill, and I didn't have any family to look after me, so I was put in a boys' home, and I was raised in a boys' home. So I'd landed in the middle of a place where, for simply being born, it's where I ended up. And I landed in the middle of that place where the people that were there were actually there for committing crimes. So at the age of 12 and a half years old, I was exposed to all the things that happened in the criminal world. And it didn't sit right with me. I didn't like to sit around and talk about crime and how to rob banks and how to get rid of people and how to do stuff like that. And so what I did is I went to the library and I found a big fat book, and it happened to be the works of Oscar Wilde. And so I read that from cover to cover and cover to cover. And I used to sit at night and think of how not to be like everybody else. And so when I had the opportunity, years down the track, when I had the opportunity to join a theatre company, and if you join the theatre company, you were guaranteed to get parole, and I thought, I'm going to do it. And so I went to do it, and as I said, I was struck by this man, and I couldn't believe that somebody would walk into a room with 15 hardened criminals, for want of a better word, and just be vulnerable to their nature, you know. And so immediately I've got a bit of a caretaker nature, and so I kept an eye on him, and a friendship grew out of that. And so over the ensuing months and years, we became close friends, and that's how it was born. And you know, and there was a when I was a child, I don't know if any of you have seen the short Cicada that Amiel and I did that went to Cannes. It was a short that was selected for Cannes in 2009, and it's an actual story. It's a documentary, and it's an actual story about a murder that happened in a hotel that my mother ran. And I was 6 years old, I think, at the time, and I witnessed it. And I not only witnessed it, I was standing right next to the person that got shot, so I, you know, had all that stuff that happens when people get shot, you know, all the horror that went with it. And that was my release from childhood. That's when I went from playing with cars to, knowing how horrible the world could be. And I told Amiel that story, and he said, do you mind if we do a doco on this? And I said, okay, look, yeah, all right. This story, I think, needs to be told. I think some people need to know that how some people are affected when they're young, and how some people are affected by crime that has nothing to do with them, the ripple effect. And also at the same time, because I find Amiel so unassuming, I find him just, I don't have to watch out for him. He's just a nice guy. And so I virtually, you know, told him the story, and I didn't feel any angst at all telling him the story. And it was rather cathartic, really. And from then, I found it easier to talk about other things that had happened in life. And then he met my partner, Leanne, who I've said on many occasions has a very beautiful heart. And so Amiel noticed that too. So we took a lot of notes, we recorded a lot of things, we put together hundreds of pages, and then they were compiled down, and a treatment came out of it that was Hail. And in Hail, we turned it into a fictional work, because a lot of the stuff you see on the screen isn't me, but even though it's me playing that part, some of it's me, but some of it is people that I've met and I was in the system with. And it's like a crossover between their character and me playing their character. Yeah, so it's a little bit of what it's like to live in the underbelly of the Melbourne seedy side of life.
Leanne, would you like to add something?
As to the question, meeting Amiel and Daddy and Cody came later, was quite daunting. They'd already had this movie organised and spoke about this movie and had it on DVD, and then came back saying that they had the funding, and I knew nothing about it. And it was, I think, about a month into it or 2 weeks into it, they put this DVD to my place, and it was all of films and shorts that Amiel had taken of me and Danny together, that he'd put together and sent to the Australian film industry for funding, and he got the funding. So then it was coming to my place to get me, to try and convince me to be in the movie. Yeah. So I'm glad I did it. Yeah, I'm really glad I did it. We had a wonderful, wonderful crew to do it with. And it's just been a brilliant experience. And beautiful people. Yeah. That it was, the way I got into it, I think was amazing. The way they got me into it was amazing, because I'm not an actor. You know, I was just Danny's girl, and that was all there was. You know, who supported Danny with what he was doing. Yeah. But then they got me acting, and here we are. Yeah. That's all I can say.
Yes, okay, please.
So what is it like to be here then? Helen from Australia. What is it like? Everyone could say, I mean, this film already premiered in Australia, so Venice generally doesn't even accept films that have screened anywhere else, so you've already got a special consideration there. And so, I mean, what did you think when you first heard about this? It must have come as a shock, and what's it like to be here, if you can all just say briefly?
Well, Danny actually dreamt that we were going to Venice a few months before we went to Venice. And as he also had dreamt that we were going to Cannes a few months before we went to Cannes. So I trust Danny's prescience when it comes to that.
Yeah, so no surprise, really.
It's quite wonderful, actually. It's it is really wonderful. I'm taken back by the beauty of the place, and I know the enormous amount of work that Amiel and Michael put into this film, and having drawn Leanne into it as a love interest, because, you know, I don't know about anybody else in this world, but I only love the person that I love, and so it was easy to do it with Leanne, and so yeah.
And I just also wanted to announce a couple of nights ago, Danny and Leanne have been together for about 10 years, but over dinner Danny proposed to Leanne, so that after the festival getting married on the island of Elba, which would be it's like a honeymoon in reverse, the festival, in many regards.
Yeah.
But in terms of the festival itself, it's really an absolute dream. I mean, to be in the company of such a ridiculous plethora of other filmmakers, and especially in the Orizzonti section, which I find this year's program to be hugely inspiring, and the directors I've met from Orizzonti so far have been amazing, and yeah, it's surreal and at once humbling, and I feel deeply privileged, and it's the first Australian dramatic feature in nearly 10 years to screen at Venice, and it was a pleasure to meet Paolo in Australia. We met a couple of months ago, and you had no idea what he would make of our crazy little film, and he luckily enjoyed it, and so it was just, for me, it's always it's an absolute pleasure. I get quite emotional, and I'm always moved to tears by the fact that these guys can not only tell their stories and share with an audience in Australia and now on an international stage something that is so hugely personal and unique, and so for me that's the real gift.
What did he say was the reason why he wanted it? What was the reason he gave as to why he wanted it? The uniqueness, the personal, what was it, do you think?
Well,
were you the person who chose it? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Were you the person who chose the film?
I'm the person who recommended the film. I mean, the director of the festival is the person who makes eventually the choice.
Okay.
But maybe we can talk about this later in private, because this is a very specific issue that regards the policy of the festival, how films are selected.
Oh, no,
it's not
just one. I have no time, I'm sorry. I'm here for this only. If you could just give one sentence why. What was it about the movie that touched you personally?
Well, I mean, personally, I find the film extremely touching. I think this film is incredibly original in the way it's actually relating a story that is about people. I mean, it's a film about two real people that reinvents their life through fiction, but still stays close to the reality of their life. And even when the film gets visceral or violent, I still feel moved by the truth that's behind that violence, behind that imagination of something darker. I feel the love between them, and I feel the love of the filmmaker towards his characters. Okay, this is not my press conference, Barbara.
I'm deeply impressed of the way, cinematographically talking, how you transform this wonderful story in something unique in its cinematographic language. I mean, it's not just, you don't see blandly violence going there, but there's a whole process of images, of music, of the combination of everything, which is just mind-blowing, I mean, by moments. Well, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much.
Well, let me ask one thing to Amiel and Michael, because earlier Leanne was mentioning the fact that this crazy little film found funding from Screen Australia, so it actually managed to receive public funding in Australia. I would like you to tell us something about the adventure of making a film like this, which is not the usual Aussie film we get to see at festivals. I mean, I guess that productively as well, it has been some kind of challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we basically, Amiel and I decided that we were going to make the film. So we didn't have any money, and we just started, and it was going to happen one way or the other, whether we were going to be shooting it on short ends on the weekend. And then we just kind of, people sort of gravitated towards the project, and they were all great people, mostly crew members that had not made a feature film before, and so we kind of ended up with this crazy sort of pirate ship in a hurricane situation, and eventually, I mean, we were just sort of working non-stop. This is what we were doing for months. Amiel and I were living in the same house, and just we just started doing casting and finding locations and stuff, and then, you know, the money came. Strangely, I mean, it's one of those things where I think it happened because it had to somehow, or somehow the funding apparatus recognised that we were, you know, serious about it, and so yeah, and then the actual, it was a very sort of unconventional way of making a film in that it was such a small crew and able to move very quickly and able to respond to whatever was happening in the moment, so that while we did have, you know, scenes and objectives and things that we were trying to shoot, we could also shoot anything interesting that arose, which is, you know, I think is part of the reason that you have that sense in the film that there is very spontaneous things. I mean, for example, the drug dealers in the street after the sort of what we call the blinding white light sequence. They were real drug dealers that that agreed to be in the film for a kebab, which is, you know, a sandwich. So that's kind of, yeah, that's how we worked.
And a kebab sandwich 5 minutes before we had to shoot because our other cast, who are also drug dealers, fell through. But it's, I mean, to be honest, in terms of, you know, comparatively looking at other Australian films and how, I suppose, how free we were able to be with Hale, there was no script necessarily. There was basically like a 22-page scene breakdown. So the narrative was absolutely laid out. But what I had was basically 22 pages of scenes, and then about 500 pages, as Danny mentioned earlier, of turns of phrase and stories and things that I knew would be emotional triggers for Daniel in the midst of the actual improvisation. Not really improvisation. I mean, I suppose it's about recalling stories and things that I knew would, you know, had the correct emotional resonance that, you know, were called for in the scene. So, you know, for example, mid-scene, I could, you know, call out a single word to Dan that was part of an anecdote he told me 3 years prior, when she was very emotional and very frustrated about his, you know, his time post-release from prison. And so that single word was, you know, spoke volumes in the midst of an improvisation, in the midst of a shoot. So it was an amazingly rigorous and in some ways it was the most intense development process I've been through, and yet what that enabled in the shoot was a very, very mercurial and very, very free way of working. So as Michael said, I mean, Michael is also, as a producer, absolutely amazing in that he you know, was trusting and not only trusting, but you know, absolutely you know, thrilled to take these kind of risks. And in terms of the Australian funding bodies, I don't think they really understood what we were doing. I think they were maybe a little bit scared of what we were doing, but you know, they let us do it. I mean, it's comparatively a very low budget film you know, by Australian standards, but I think, you know, my previous work as a documentary maker, and I suppose the fact that this was one step across into drama, not necessarily, you know, because there was its documentary roots, it was certainly helped in terms of the funding apparatus being kicked off.
Adelaide Film Festival supported the film also?
Yeah, Katrina Sedgwick at
Katrina
the
Sedgwick,
Adelaide
yeah.
Film Festival was
Okay.
really instrumental in the financing of the entire film. She was the first person on board, in effect, and she is phenomenal in Australia in terms of the filmmakers she supported. And what was amazing about that was it not only was funding for the film, but it was also a deadline, basically, that I suppose
made the others fall in. Yeah, she's really like a cultural superhero. You know, she's amazing. So, yeah, no, it's great. We were very lucky though. I mean, in terms of the sort of average period to get a film financed in Australia, it happened very, very quickly. And that's the reason why, because the Adelaide came on board first, and then that forced the others to fall into line. So yeah, we were lucky. Yeah, it was great. And they did. They left us alone, basically. I mean, we had friends that were making films at the same time that were getting 15 pages of notes on the edits, and we would just get notes back saying good. You know, I didn't quite know what to make of it, I think, so, yeah.
Okay, unfortunately our time is up. I'm very sorry about this, because there's certainly a lot of other questions that you might want to ask to Amiel and his producer and his cast, but of course, if you want to, since this is a kind of very casual meeting, now that they are here at the Club Orizzonti, you can get closer to them and maybe ask what you still want to ask them. And thanks a lot to Amiel and all the others, and thanks a lot to you for staying for this press conference.
And thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you. Yep.
Yes, thank you.
And
I love to